It's the fifth week now of our course on establishing a daily practice. So again, we've discussed now mostly the preparatory practices for the first few weeks, discussing how to set up a space for meditation, how to arrange an altar, all the things that one does at the beginning of the session, such as visualizing the merit field and setting one's motivation. So last week we spoke actually about the heart of the meditation session, which is about how to perform analytical meditation on Lamrim topics. And so it was a general presentation of what is the meaning of analytical meditation. I spoke a bit about mindfulness meditation and how that's understood today and how we can understand it in the traditional teachings. And then about how to understand analytical meditation in relation to placement meditation focused on a single object. And so this week, we have quite a bit of time in terms of the sessions. We have 6 sessions total. I believe usually this module is taught in 4 sessions, so we have a little more space. So I'm going to go through the Lamrim topics just one by one, so you have an idea of what is in this text. Now, again, also last week I discussed about what is Lamrim and how did this originate, a little bit about the history of it. And so you understand that when we say Lamrim, it means the stages of the path, that it's arranging the Buddha's teachings in a stepwise manner. So it's not that the writers of Lamrim, and especially Tsongkhapa in the case of Gaelic or the Gaelic school, it's not that they are writing their own ideas here so much as they're codifying or organizing the teachings into a structured way such that we can think about how to meditate on the subjects one at a time. And so this week I'll just go through the outline of the Lamrim and then discuss each subject a little bit in detail. Now, as I said, Lamrim is a general term. There's a whole bunch of literature that falls under this this rubric. And so there was originally the text by Atisha, was the first text in Tibetan. And later on, there was a lineage of practice that was then inherited by Tsongkhapa, and he wrote 3 main texts in the Lamrim, actually. Tsongkhapa wrote the Lamrim Chembo, which many of you know, the Great Stages of the Path, which is available in English. And then the middle length Lamrim, which is also now available in English, just came out a few years ago, was translated, which is similar topics. It's the same structure as the Great Stages of the Path. The only difference is that in the Great Stages of the Path, there is a lot of this extra discussion about, for example, giving a lot of sources, giving quotations from sutras to show the source for each subject, and then a lot of argumentation about different points of view and showing how there could be potential wrong views that one could fall into or going in the wrong direction. And so trying to establish the correct way of understanding according to this tradition. But in the middle length Lamrim, it's just focused on the topics and how to meditate on them. And then finally, Tsongkhapa wrote a very short text, the Lines of Experience, which is also available in English. There's a commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on that, called Illuminating the Path to Enlightenment. And so that's just a bunch of verses. It's I think about 30 verses, very condensed, just for daily reflection. Now, later within the Gaelic school, there are many other authors who composed Lamrim texts. The 5th Dalai Lama composed the words of Manjushri, and the 2 of the Panchen Lamas composed texts, the Swift Path and the Easy Path, which are both available in English now. And then there were several others. And most recently, in terms of what is considered a major Lamrim text in our school, is the Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand by Bonko Rinpoche, which some of you might have seen. That's generally the basis for a lot of the teachings given in the FBMT. So that was about 100 years ago that was composed. And of course, teachers still give commentaries on this. But the point is that when we say Lamrim, they're all focused on the same basic structure. There's sometimes a little detail about how they changed particular chapter headings and so forth, but mainly it's a particular structure of meditation. So we're just going to go through that in a general sense rather than with reference to any particular text. So Zila, is it possible to share the screen? Because it seemed like it wasn't possible for me to do that on this computer last week.
Venerable, which would you like me to share, the prayers
So
or
the session 5.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so here we have establishing a daily practice, session 5. Okay, so here, this is outline of the Lamrim. So as I just said, we'll just first discuss what are these topics, and then I'm just going to go through them one by one. And so we see it starts even before we have the outlines with this relying on a fully qualified virtuous friend. This table I took from a previous course that was taught at Kopan, and so this was available. Now, we see here that having this reliance on a qualified virtuous friend as the first subject, that's actually Tsongkhapa's innovation. It's a bit unique because a lot of times this is presented as a much more advanced practice. Once you gain conviction in the teaching, then you find a teacher and relate to them in this way. But Tsongkhapa felt that this was essential even at the very beginning. The point is that our relationships with our teachers, those who teach us, is critical for how we progress on the path. Now, for some people, this is challenging because it's not something, again, that I mentioned this a little bit last week, that in our culture is often not understood or even not looked upon very favorably, this idea of devoting yourself to a different person. And so, of course, I use the example of a sports coach. The point being that in our culture, there is some understanding of the need to have guidance from people and to relate to them in a particular way. I mentioned I give the example of my wrestling coach, and again, to come back to that example, I can see that there was a difference in terms of how much benefit people got from that relationship based upon how they interacted with this person who. I remember my coach was quite a strong personality, and for some people that was quite difficult to deal with. For my side, I always tended to try to see the positives. That doesn't mean that I just ignored things that were challenging, but rather than focusing on or getting hung up on that, I tried to see what can I take from this relationship, and I gained a lot from it. He was certainly not. It's a very different person than me, and we had, it wasn't that I just adopted everything that he did or said, but in terms of coaching, in terms of relating to this person, then I was able to get a lot out of it from taking seriously the advice that he gave and not getting hung up on the things that didn't work for me. Whereas I saw some other people on the wrestling team who oftentimes were actually better than me in terms of their skill, but it became quite an obstacle to them because they'd had a bad relationship with the coach and wouldn't take his advice, or would kind of talk about he says this or this, it's not a nice thing to say, and then it actually just gets in the way. It wasn't really helping in terms of their own progression. So it's similar here. Now, one of the differences, of course, with a teacher in a spiritual sense is that you're not just relating to them in terms of their ability to teach you a skill like wrestling or some kind of academic skill. You're taking them as an example in terms of their behavior, and their example in life should be something that we want to emulate. So we have to be very careful when we choose. We want to choose somebody that we can relate to that way. But within that, then there is an understanding here that we try not to get hung up on the parts of them that are more challenging for us, or that are not. We don't have to. It doesn't mean that we have to adopt that behavior ourselves, but in terms of how we relate to them, it'll make a big difference in how we progress in the path. If we have the sense that that this teacher is not very good, that this teacher, I can learn something from them, but I know better than them in a lot of things, and they're really not very qualified, then that kind of makes our mind quite tight, and we don't get a lot out of the relationship. It's not that important in terms of how they are from their side. It's in terms of how we view it. I sometimes think of it as this is like having positive attitude. We talk about that a lot now in modern culture, that if we have a positive attitude about things, then things seem much lighter, and we progress. So likewise here, if we see that I'm very fortunate to have this teacher, that they have such extraordinary qualities, then we can get a lot out of it, even if from their side they're not that advanced in the path. It doesn't mean that we open ourselves to being manipulated, which is, I think, a concern for a lot of people. And it's very important actually to recognize the difference between those two things. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time, as this is meant to be just a general overview, and we'll get to each subject individually. But I guess I'm focusing on it because Tsongkhapa focuses on it. And there's a reason he places this at the beginning, and shows how important this attitude is towards making progress. So we'll come back to it again in the next slide, and after we go through the outline. But then we see that then there's A and B in terms of the whole Lamrim text is divided into these A and B, with B being much a longer subject. But A is in terms of how do we even begin and decide to follow a spiritual path, which is the stimulus to extract the essence. So the author here had put in PHR, which means perfect human rebirth. So thinking about the fact that our life is so precious, that the opportunity we have as human beings is so rare, and that we can use this life. So sometimes we might feel very negative about our life and feel I have a very bad circumstance. There's not a lot I can do. I have so few opportunities. But we think about the positive things that we do have and what we can do with our time, and thereby gaining a sense of, I want to use this life well. So with that, then we go on to how to extract the essence from the perfect human rebirth. That's the rest of the text. So it's divided into the 3 scopes. So this is based on the text by Atisha that I mentioned last week. So Atisha had divided the teachings of the Buddha into this stepwise manner of the beings of the smaller capacity, middle, and great, which is not actually 3 different people. It's one's own development. Oneself goes through these stages. Now, he had certainly basis in the sutras. We can actually find teachings that talk about things in this way, but in terms of structuring it specifically as a method of practice, this was Atisha's innovation. Now, the story goes, I think I mentioned last week about Tsongkhapa and how he had, according to the tradition, had direct perception of the deity Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, who instructed him on how to compose this text. And the story is that that Manjushri had instructed Tsongkhapa to discuss the Lamrim in terms of the 3 principal aspects of the path. Some of you might know that expression, which means renunciation, bodhicitta, and the correct view of emptiness. But then Tsongkhapa, he took that as his basis, but also included this presentation of the 3 scopes. He interwove those two ways of understanding the progression. And the story is that Manjushri then sort of scolded him and said, "Isn't what I taught you good enough?" But then Tsongkhapa replied to Manjushri, which is sort of the tradition that we always debate. So, well, it absolutely, but I didn't think it was harmful to include this as a kind of an ornament. It's like it ornamented the text. It made it enhanced the clarity of it without taking away from the basis of what Manjushri was saying. So this becomes the basic structure of the text. So the small scope is when somebody is thinking beyond just this life. So they start thinking beyond just immediate needs. I may have mentioned this in an earlier teaching here too, because one of my teachers, Gache Rinpoche, when questioned on this point, he had said that really what it means is getting out of our sense of what's going to make me happy right now. So even if it means thinking just in the future of this life, just trying to think about planning long term about how to gain happiness rather than just going for immediate gratification of our immediate needs, which then leads to disappointment again and again. But here it's also trying to think beyond this life. So we have to actually start questioning about the possibility of reincarnation. Now that's something that again, I think I did mention in the previous talk here about, for a lot of people in today's world, it's not enough just to read the Lamrim, because a lot of the reasons that are presented there might seem a bit obsolete given our current understanding of things in terms of science, in terms of evolution. And even within the Tibetan tradition, actually, the Lamrim text is mainly focused on practice. The discussion about how to gain conviction and reincarnation actually occurs more in the philosophical texts, which are different texts. But even so, today, it can be very helpful to think about the reasons that within a scientific framework. And so I'd suggested some books about that, I think in a message I sent out before. I hope everyone was able to receive that. But again, if we have time at the end, if people have questions about that, I'm happy to continue talking about that, because that's very important. We shouldn't think that's a side subject and that it's going to get in the way of our doing practice with the Lamrim. In order to gain conviction in this, it's something that has to come from us. It shouldn't be that we decide, okay, I accept this because it says so in the text. So in order to, as it says here, yearn for a good rebirth, we have to have some sense that this is something that makes sense to us. So then this section, training in the small scope, you see it as yearning for a good rebirth includes thinking about death and impermanence, thinking this life won't last long, and then lower rebirth, which really means the Tibetan term Song, it means like unfortunate migration. So it means thinking that it's possible we could end up in a very difficult place, a much worse place than we are now, and thereby just pursuing pleasures in this lifetime. What's it going to matter to us if we end up in a much worse situation in the future? So thereby thinking about our motivation with that perspective. And then the means for happy rebirth. So what do we do if we want to have a better life next time? Well, it includes taking refuge and then developing faith in cause and effect. So again, we'll go through all of those, all one at a time in the subsequent slides. And then we have the middle scope, which is thinking not just about this lifetime, not just about future lifetimes, but thinking that even if I had a positive rebirth, even if I was born in the best circumstances, it's still not satisfactory. And one of the main reasons is that it's impermanent. It's not going to last forever. So again, I'll have to be born somewhere else. And then do I just want that to go on forever? But then thinking, even if it was the best circumstance, it's in the end, it's not so great. It's not it's not the like in some religions there's idea of being in a permanent heaven. It's not something like that. It has any life we're in is going to have all kinds of struggles, as the Indian master Aryadeva said. For the people, for the best of people, they have the mental sufferings. For the people in the worst circumstances, there's physical suffering. So whatever situation we're in, we're going to have one kind of suffering or another. And no matter how much we have, no matter how content we are with, or not content, it might not be the right word, but in terms of how much all of our needs are met, we'll always find things to be discontent about. We'll always feel like, well, my neighbor has more than me, or we'll always feel that I could lose this at any time. There's all kinds of mental sufferings that can arise. And then so we have yearning for liberation, which is thinking about the suffering of cyclic existence, reflecting on the fact that everything is dissatisfactory. Now, this can seem like a depressing subject, but if we see it as a means to think, well, is there something better? Right? So then we have ascertaining the path to liberation. So thinking that actually there could be something more than this. Is there liberation is synonymous with nirvana. It's the cessation of suffering. So within that, we think about the 12 links of dependent originations. We'll talk about that a bit later. That's a very detailed description. You see how delusions bind us. So really about how our minds are creating this perpetual cycle. We talk about the Four Noble Truths. We have the noble truth of suffering, and then the noble truth of origination of suffering. So it's really focusing on those two, especially the origination. And then we have training in the great scope, which is then thinking it's not just me, that this, so thus far it has been talking about my own spiritual path, but then thinking, how can I use this as a way to benefit others? How can I make my life meaningful to as many beings as possible? So we have the gateway to the Mahayana, which means bodhicitta. It's talking about if one develops the mind of bodhicitta, the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of others, that is the gateway, in the sense that once one does that, once one has that mindset, one has entered the Mahayana path. And then developing bodhicitta, how to develop that mind or train with that mind. So we have equanimity, and then sevenfold cause and effect, and exchanging self for others. So we'll go through those again. And then training in the bodhisattva practices. So once we have that mindset, how do we actually do practices to get enlightened? So the first four perfections, which is generosity, ethical discipline, patience, and joyous effort. Those are, if you go through the Lamrim, at least in detail, you go through those one at a time, but here in the overview, we'll just go through them as a general set. And then we have the last two perfections, which are considered much harder, which is training in concentration and training in wisdom, wisdom realizing emptiness. And then finally, the uncommon path of Vajrayana. So we'll talk about that a bit at the end, and I've mentioned that a few times before, which Vajrayana is essentially synonymous with Tantra, or Tantrayana. And that's something that is a lot of people might have misconceptions about that. I'm not suggesting all of you do, but in general, in the world, it is something that it's become kind of a part of fad culture, even in the West. I don't know how things are now in America. I haven't been there in quite a while, but at least when I was a young person, we heard this in movies and often on TV. People would talk about Tantra, and that it's important to understand that what they're talking about is quite different than how it's understood in the Buddhist context. So I'll talk about that a bit at the end, but the point is that within Gelug practice, within Tibetan Buddhism, that this is an important element of the practice that for at very advanced stages. So within the Lamrim, there isn't the real discussion of how to engage in such practice. It's just at the very end of the Lamrim, it says after one has trained in this path, then when one is qualified, then to engage in the Vajrayana practices. Now, there are many other texts that discuss this, most specifically the great stages of the mantra path, which is also by Tsongkhapa. So I'll just give a brief introduction to that at the end, and maybe talk about it a bit next week too. But it's just understood within the framework here that all of this is an essential foundation. If somebody doesn't have these understandings, then to talk about engaging in Vajrayana practices, it might make some kind of imprint, but it's not able to be done in the real qualified way. So we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay. Okay, so guru devotion. Now, I've used this word. I've gone back and forth sometimes in translation about whether it's the right way to translate something, because especially the word guru devotion in English, it really, this phrase guru devotion, it really can sound like I mentioned before, people have the idea of like somebody's manipulating you, that you just give yourself over to them. It's important to understand the distinctions here. So the word in Tibetan, what's actually used in the Lamrim, it says shenin densu. So it means the manner of relying on a spiritual friend. So guru devotion is not the way that we would translate that. But I discovered after some time, I think the reason they use the word guru devotion, the word in Tibetan, lama lagupa, which means like, it can mean like respect for one's teacher, one's lama, but devotion does capture some of the flavor of the word in Tibetan. But the understanding is that one has to have a kind of awe or reverence. One has to feel that this person is really somebody that deserves that, and wanting to then practice in a way that allows us to gain the most from that relationship. But it's really important to understand. I give that example of Tsongkhapa and debating with Manjushri, that in our tradition, it's never understood that you should just give up your ability to think for yourself and decide that the teacher, I just do whatever they say without questioning it. That's very clear in the text, that at no point should you not question. It's a matter of what you do if you find something is not in accordance with your own understanding. And it may be that at a certain point you find that a teacher, and hopefully this doesn't happen, this is not ideal, but if you find that a teacher is giving advice that is contrary to the Buddha's teachings and is actively harmful potentially, then you should distance yourself from the teacher. but it's important if one has really made a commitment to the relationship, to maintain a sense of respect for the teacher. Now, this can be very hard if there are cases where the teacher is engaging in abusive behavior. Now, that again, the point here is that we really ought to examine the teacher first and make sure that we're really able to do that. But I mention that because it has become a problem nowadays in modern culture. There's been quite a few examples. And I won't get into that now. I could give an entirely separate talk on that. But I think one of the points to make at the beginning is that there is perhaps a misunderstanding in the beginning that students are thinking that when they devote to the teacher, thereby it means that they shouldn't question, or that they no longer are accountable for their own decisions because the teacher is making the decisions. That's not part of the tradition, and it's a misconception that may have become widespread now. So ideally, we should have a teacher where this kind of relationship is something we want to engage in because we recognize the qualities of them. I feel that with my two main teachers, Khepje Rinpoche and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that from my perspective, as long as I knew them, for one thing, I never had any sense of any kind of manipulation or any kind of misuse of the relationship, but more importantly, that I felt they were worthy of that. They were people that were so extraordinary. It was beyond anything I had experienced in an ordinary people. And it was enough for me to want to make that relationship the core of my life, trying to understand who they really were, and still doing so, even though after they passed away, still trying to examine what I learned from them and what their examples showed about what it's like actually to be a human being. It's a very different way of being human. So if one has that kind of relationship, then it makes a lot of sense to want to engage in it in the proper way, as we talk about here. So this picture here, this is a picture of Marpa with his student Milarepa. Some of you might, I imagine many of you might know this story, which is one of the most famous stories in Tibetan literature about the relationship of a teacher and their student. And it's also quite challenging if we really think about what happened here. As we see here, that at the early stages of the relationship, Marpa even appeared to be quite abusive of the student Milarepa. It's understood that this had to do with the student having created very negative karma. Milarepa had murdered many people as a young person, and the teacher recognized that in order to tame his mind, for him to purify the effects of what he had done, it was required that he went through a lot of hardships. But it's generally understood that Marpa was an enlightened master, that he was doing this out of great wisdom. And in the end, it became extraordinarily beneficial for the student. You can read the life story of Milarepa and his devotion to his teacher, even after he went through these trials, finally meditating in the mountains and gaining a lot from that relationship. But in the early stages, of course, Marpa instructed him, gave him almost nonsensical instructions to build the tower and then dismantle it and build it again. That tower is still there in Tibet. If it does sounds like a fable, but there actually is a tower where it's said to have been built by Milarepa there as part of his trials. So anyway, we have what kind of contemplations. So of course, the point of this talk is how to contemplate on the different topics of the Lamrim. So when we do so with a particular subject, then we go through, there'll be an outline in the Lamrim here. So in terms of the subject of Guru devotion, we have benefits of correctly devoting oneself to a spiritual teacher. So we think about what is the purpose of this? What am I going to gain from this? So there's a list that's given in the Lamrim of 8 benefits. You can look through that. But the idea, what's the point of meditating on that, is just to gain a sense that this is something worth doing. What is the benefit I could gain from engaging in this kind of practice? And the disadvantages of failing to do so. What would I not gain from not doing so? So there's examples also historically with the Buddha's life itself, that we look at the Buddha and his students and how much they gained from their relationship with the Buddha. If we accept the Buddha as an enlightened being, which in some sense is axiomatic if we're Buddhists, it doesn't mean that it's axiomatic in general. We have to examine, is there anyone who is enlightened? But generally speaking, most of us as Buddhists would accept if someone was enlightened, it was Buddha Shakyamuni. But even so, at that time, some of the students didn't gain a lot from the relationship. Some of you might know Ananda, who was the attendant of the Buddha for many years, and was very devoted to the Buddha and gained a lot from that, and eventually achieved a liberation shortly after the Buddha had passed away. But some of you might not know that before Ananda was the attendant, there was another attendant who actually failed to see the Buddha as an enlightened being, and finally decided to leave the relationship because he decided that the Buddha was not a qualified teacher. So we can see that, I mean, if maybe that person was right, we always have to examine these possibilities, but another quite strong possibility is that the person from their side was focusing too much on what appeared to be faults from their own mind. Because a lot of other people were gaining a lot from that relationship. But if somebody has that strong viewpoint and decides they understand better, which is essentially what he said before he left, then they'd failed to gain from the relationship. Or we say that of doing so incorrectly is that not only do you not engage in it at all, but you do it incorrectly. You see what happens if people engage in a relationship with a teacher, but then actually end up having a negative view of the teacher, and even sometimes speaking harshly to the teacher and so forth, and how the consequences that can have for their mind. Just like we can think about being in an ordinary relationship with anybody. It can have wonderful benefits if engaged in properly, but if it can lead to all kinds of suffering if it just becomes an opportunity for us to project our problems onto the other person and argue back and forth. So then the actual practice of devoting, so then it says devoting yourself through thought, which is training in seeing the teacher as an enlightened being. So again, that is something that can easily be misunderstood. It's quite a subtle point. What my teacher at Sarah, now I mentioned two teachers before, but I have other teachers as well. So my philosophical teacher for many years was Geshe Ngawang Sangye, who's now the abbot at Gyume Monastery, so he's not at Sarah anymore. But his understanding of this, and again, I say his understanding, you see that in the tradition, there are always debates about these things. Different people have different opinions. But he felt that it's not that you believe your teacher is an enlightened being. You don't know, and you don't have to adopt a belief if you don't know something. The point is that you cultivate that perception, you cultivate that training. I think of it as if you're acting in a play, you have to cultivate the perception that your fellow actors are the people that they're acting as. If you can't do that, it's going to be very hard to get into the character, as we say. So likewise here, we recognize that in this relationship, I'm viewing this teacher as the Buddha, and I'm viewing myself as a student of the Buddha. Then we can gain from that relationship as if the actual Buddha was here. If instead we think that there was this enlightened being 2,500 years ago, but nobody's like that anymore, and I have an inferior replacement to that now, then that's how it will be experienced by us, and we will not gain a lot from the relationship. So we're cultivating that kind of perception, regardless of how the person is from their own side. But again, it's a lot easier to do so if we can choose somebody that we feel we have some suspicion that maybe that really is the case. If we just choose this with somebody who, without checking carefully, then it turns out to have all kinds of behaviors that we don't agree with, then it's going to be harder to do that. And then devoting yourself to action. So this also is a big part of the path in terms of how we behave towards the teacher, just simply the way we act in terms of manners. There's a lot written about this in the traditional text, that we always sit on a lower seat and we always face towards the teacher. We never turn our back to them. Now, again, that seems very much like a cultural etiquette, but it's useful to learn to train in these things because it certainly affects our minds. I noticed that in terms of my own relationship with my teachers, and now, as I mentioned, having my own students, not that I'm qualified like my teachers were by any means, but I notice from their own side, the ones that adopt these practices, I'm able to reach them much, much more. I recognize that what I say to them is more helpful for them if they're behaving in a way that's in accordance with how it's generally understood to behave towards a teacher, but also just towards a senior monk. It makes it a lot easier to have that kind of relationship. Just simply the way that somebody holds their body, the way that they act physically. But then, so devoting yourself through actions, that's the first part. But then also there's talk about following the teacher's advice. That's actually more important, right? So not just that we know how to bow to them and so forth, but that we take what they say seriously and live in accordance with that. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to help us very much if they give advice. But again, as always, we always need to check that advice with our own wisdom. And so if the teacher gives us advice that is challenging for us, we can say, I'm going to gradually get into this and see and check. We don't have to just immediately throw away all of our preconceptions and adopt what they say. Now, we see this in this picture of Milarepa. In some sense, that is what he was doing. But at the same time, when we look at the story of his life, it seems that he was having all kinds of doubts in his mind. He kept wondering, is this really a qualified teacher? Why is he treating me this way? But he was desperate at this point. He just had nothing else left to do except to give his life over to the teacher. Fortunately, he chose the right one, and it ended up being very beneficial for him. But like anything, in some sense, this is a bit of a fable. And not to say that's not a true story. It seems that it was historically true, but it's presented in a way that is kind of a caricature. And it's not that every relationship is going to unfold exactly in this way. So we have to think, what is the moral of the story? What is it trying to teach us? And be realistic and practical about how it relates to our own relationship with our teacher. Okay, so maybe we can go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, there's one I see in the chat. When is it acceptable to have multiple teachers? That's a good point. There's certainly nothing wrong with having multiple teachers. It's just a matter of understanding the best way to do so. For one thing, there's no need to just go out and seek many teachers for the sake of being able to say I have many teachers, right? It's more important that we relate properly to one. But at the same time, if we have the opportunity to meet many teachers, there are different stages in our development when it might be useful. For myself, when I was a layperson, when I was a young person in college, I actually I made it a point to seek out many teachers. Whenever I heard that there was a Lama, a Tibetan Lama in town, or even a Buddhist monk from another tradition sometimes, I would go to see them because I wanted to have exposure to as many teachers as possible. And I was often quite impressed by many of them, and to just have that imprint. At the same time, recognizing that I knew who my main teachers were at a certain point. And so I was careful about, I wouldn't just go to a teacher and say, I give my life to you, tell me what to do. If I had already done something had a relationship with another teacher in that way, you don't want to have conflicting advice. But in terms of just going to the teaching and receiving teachings, the main thing is that we've checked carefully and think that we can maintain a proper perception of this teacher, that we don't go and take them as a teacher at one point and then later decide that we don't like them and that we reject what they say. That has to happen. There's a way to do that. Again, if we find the teacher is being abusive or something like that, but ideally we want to check first and check their background carefully. But once we do so, if we want to have exposure to many teachers, it's okay. And then similarly, on a sort of a practical level, like I mentioned, my philosophical teacher in the monastery, Geshe Ngawang Sangye, for my first 7 or 8 years at Sarijay, I only had him as my philosophy teacher. And I felt it was going to be harmful to go to too many different teachers for teachings on how to debate and how to learn Buddhist philosophy, because I wanted to be able to focus on what the teachings he gave, and I would record them and listen to them again. But gradually, as I found myself more proficient in the debate process, I started going to other teachers. And also Geshe Ngawang Sangye moved on, as I mentioned. He went off to Gyume college, and so I didn't have access to him most of the time. So you have to know for yourself. The main thing is you have to make sure you can make something out of the relationship. I think I may have used the example earlier about it's great to have lots of holy objects in your house. You can have statues and tankas and so forth, but if they're all sitting there collecting dust, It's probably better that you just have one, and that you can properly make water bowl offerings to it every day and keep it clean. So likewise, if you're able to maintain the relationship with many teachers in a positive way, it can be beneficial. But it's not absolutely necessary. And it's good to have an idea of who is your main, or maybe one or two main teachers that you really consider their advice central. And so if another teacher gives you contrary advice, then you decide, well, I have these, I'm really more devoted to this teacher, and without a respect, I will say thank you, but I'm following this advice. But also maybe not ask advice in that way. Know what kind of questions we ask from different teachers. So like again, with my example of my teacher Gache Sangha, I never went to ask him actually about what retreats to do or what meditation to do. I already had instruction on that from my other two teachers, and mainly it was philosophical questions that I was asking him, or about how to behave as a monk, things like that. And even with that, I'd have different teachers that were helping me. So you know the different capacity of the different teacher, and what role are they playing in your life. Okay, so and you said because of accessibility. So yes, you also have to see who's accessible, and if a teacher that is really extraordinary is coming to town and you only have that one chance, it might be good to go and see them. You have just to make sure that just because they have a big name is not the main point, that it's somebody that you've really researched carefully and feel that it will be opportunity to have this this meeting with them that might not come again. Okay, so next we have identified the perfect human rebirth. This is the first meditation within the general, within the main subject of the text. So here we see 8 leisures and 10 fortunes. This is just ways of reflecting upon this life that we have. So leisure, I think, is a good translation. Some people think it ought to be something like freedom, but the word in Tibetan literally means leisure. Delwa means like going slowly, having free time. And so the idea is that we need to recognize how extraordinary it is to have the time that we have. Sometimes people think, oh, I have all this time, I'll kill time. That's an expression we have in English, but it's quite the opposite here. Time is something that we want to treasure. We're so fortunate to actually have some spare time to do things. Historically, it was actually quite a rare thing. If we look in human history, most people spent most of their time trying to survive and just to have basic access to needs of life. And even today, there are many people who live that way. And among people who do have free time, there's also things that we have access to. So for one thing, most of us, to some extent or another, are in enough decent health that we don't have to spend all of our time caring for our body, or that we can go to teachings. We're all able to attend these teachings. Might take that for granted, but for some people that might be very difficult. It might be a big obstacle. So it's good to reflect on that. We don't think about it. It doesn't immediately come to mind, but we think, oh, so there's the question just now, there's accessibility. So we think, oh, I'm so unfortunate, there's only one teacher that comes here every year, but how fortunate we are that we can actually go to the teaching, that we don't have to have somebody push us in a wheelchair or whatever other obstacle there might be, or that we can hear the teaching, we're not deaf, that we can comprehend the teaching, that we don't have some kind of major mental impediment that makes it difficult for us to understand what the person is talking about. So this is a meditation, right? Again, sometimes we think of meditation as just quieting the mind, but here it's reflecting on this, changing our perspective, reflecting on this again and again, such that it becomes natural, that we feel positive every day. I'm so fortunate to have this day and this time, and how do I use it? So like when we talk about fortunes here, it's the fortune of meeting the teachings. That we're so fortunate to have met the Buddhist teachings, even though it's available in the world today, but the way things are, somebody could be in the room next to you and they don't have access to it because they just never went to the right website or whatever other reason. We're so fortunate to have met these teachings and to be able to make use of them, and to have met qualified teachers, to have have access to the right textbooks and the right teachings. So then what do we do with that while we have that opportunity? So we think about the usefulness of a perfect human rebirth. We think about what we can do with our lives. we might think that it's not possible. We look at somebody like Milarepa, and they had better conditions then. It's questionable whether somebody had better conditions then when Milarepa said he barely had enough clothing to put on his body, right? So there was teachings available in Tibet at the time, but it's not so different from how it is now. In the 10th century in Tibet, it was not nearly as organized as it was 500 years later. There was a lot of mixed teachers. There were some teachers who were really teaching the wrong teachings, and there was not much structure to it. There was a few people here and there scattered around. Most of the people in Tibet didn't have access to that. So the fact that we have that access today, we have an opportunity, and we can do something with it. There's no reason that we can't do that if we put our minds to it. It's just a matter of making time for it, making a priority. And then we talk about the difficulty of obtaining one. So that obtaining this human life, we think how incredibly rare this is. It's quite easy if we really think about it. Whether we accept, because of course in the traditional teachings, they talk about different worlds and about different spirits and all kinds of realms that may or may not make sense to us. But simply in terms of what we can experience, we look at the number of animals in this world who have no opportunity to transform their minds in any meaningful way. And then even among human beings, how few people have the opportunity to really practice in the way that we do. If we're living in a country where there's access to these teachings, there's freedom to practice them, there's enough resources that we have some free time to do this. So we think how rare it is to have that opportunity, and also time-wise, of course, in the history of planet Earth, how small a piece of time it was when people actually have free time, when they're human beings at all, first of all, but secondly, that there's a complex culture where people have access to things and can discuss and have teachings. It's very rare. We never know when this opportunity is going to come again. And so we want to make use of it now and not procrastinate. So that's the main goal of doing this kind of meditation, is to change our way of thinking, to feel positive of what we have and feel that we want to make use of it. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so now we have death and impermanence. I apologize. This picture of the funeral, some people might find disturbing. I don't know, but of course, this is what we're trying to do here, is think about things that people generally don't try to think about. It's considered probably impolite in normal conversation to bring up some of these topics. But as Buddhist practitioners, these are things that we want to remember again and again. So we think that I have this opportunity, this great life, but it's not going to last forever. So first of all, we think about why are we doing this meditation, the disadvantages of not remembering death. And we think that if we don't think about how we're going to die, then we'll get into the delusion that it's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen anytime soon. Or just not, even if we believe at some level, of course, I'm going to die, but it's just that we don't bring it into our everyday experience. We think, I have a few other things I want to do before I get to my Dharma practice. We think that we might not get the opportunity. So we think about the advantages. Then it's the second point of remembering death, that we then can put time into the teachings. Now, with all of these subjects, if you have the Lamrim Chenmo or any of the Lamrim texts, they will give a lot more detail about the kind of things to meditate on. So I'm just, again, giving a general introduction to the topics, but just if you have time, as I mentioned last week within the session about doing analytical meditation, then you don't have to feel that when you're meditating, you can't look at the book at all. If you don't have all the points memorized, you can go. So if you go through the advantages of remembering death, there'll be eight of them, I think, listed in the text. You go through them one at a time and spend a few minutes reflecting on each one, or however long is meaningful for you. And you can then also be creative with that. You don't have to just think about those words, but it's meant to inspire contemplation, right? That it's otherwise, if we just sit there trying to think of the advantages ourselves, it might not come to mind so easily. So then we have actual meditation on death is the final two, points 3 and 4. And there's two general ways to do that. One is a 9-point death meditation, which you'll see very clearly outlined in the Lamrim, which is three groups of 3. So the first group thinking about how death is definite, and then thinking about how the time of death is indefinite. I think we did this meditation last week. And then finally, that at the time of death, only whatever Dharma practice we have done, whatever mental cultivation we have created, is going to be a benefit to us. That we can't take with us the things of this world, our family, our friends, our wealth, that all of that will have to be left behind. So it's just going through those points one at a time. And meditation on the death process is just imagining what it would be like to die. We can make this very powerful by making it real for us. We don't have to just, the traditional way, of course, is just thinking about the stages of death, which talks about the dissolution of the different elements of the body, which we can certainly do. But we might also think about it in a more general sense of what it would be like if today I found out I have terminal lung cancer. The doctor gave me that diagnosis. And what would I do? Then what would it be like having that discussion with my family? And then I have 6 months, and what kind of things would I be doing with my time? And going through what would it be like trying to go through different medicines, trying chemotherapy, and all of the struggles that come from that. It's unpleasant things to think about, but it's very useful if we can contemplate on this. And in some sense, it's a preparation. Something like that's going to happen eventually. And if we've given some thought to it, if we thought about how would I react, then we'll be more prepared when it happens, and we'll also live our lives in a different way, based on the not just the possibility, but the certainty that something like that's eventually going to happen. So how do I use my life day to day in a more meaningful way? Okay, so now we can go on to the next slide. So now we have lower rebirth. Again, I think the translation really ought to be unfortunate migration. But nevertheless, it gives you some idea. You see this picture here of the wheel of life, which is the wheel of samsara, really, wheel of existence. It's being held in the lap of the Lord of Death. That's the creature that you see the feet. So in the lower part of that wheel is the miserable migrations. Beings are born in these places. So again, this can be very challenging for people if we feel this is not something real. So there's two ways to approach it. One is to contemplate it in a more metaphorical sense, which is to think about, regardless of whether there's literally a hell realm, that there are certainly migrations that are something like that. There are many places we can be born in the world where it's just constant struggle and violence, or constant hunger and thirst. Not to mention some animals who were born that way. Another way to think about it is to try to think about how could this exist? Is this possible? Like I talked about before in terms of reincarnation. We can bring in different ways of thinking about this. What reasons do we have to believe this does not exist? In what ways does it seem obsolete, these teachings? And what evidence might there be today? And again, I don't think I've included much in that list about this particular subject, but in terms of the existence of ghosts and even the existence of people having experiences of hell, what are they talking about? In some sense, we think logically about, if of course jumping to karma is quite an advanced understanding if we really have some kind of conviction in that. But if we do feel that way, then we think, well, what would be the consequence of extremely negative behavior? What's going to happen as a result of that? The understanding in the teachings is that these are kind of spirals that one gets into. It's the word nyawa in Tibetan. It's like it becomes something that's very difficult to get out of. You get into a bad cycle, and it just perpetuates itself. We see that just within our own world. People who they fall in with bad friends, and then they make all kinds of enemies, and it's impossible to get out of that cycle, because as soon as you try to get out, your enemies are going to come and attack you. So you always have to be on the defense. It's also between countries. We see that oftentimes wars happen because the countries are trying to defend themselves, and each one wants to make sure that I'm not the one who falls behind in the arms struggle. So even though nobody really wants to go to war, it's an inevitable consequence of that. So these to be understood as mental states of patterns of behavior, but then just get taken to the extreme that just gets worse and worse, lifetime to lifetime. So of course, the purpose of thinking about this is not to just feel miserable. It's to think that there are how do you say, there are possibly very strong consequences to actions, and that to really feel a strong sense of I do not want to engage in actions that are going to create this kind of experience for myself. But again, this is something, this is probably one of the hardest meditations because it's so obscure for many of us, and many of us might feel that this is not something that we accept. And honestly, I can say after many years of this, I still feel a sense a bit of agnosticism about it. It's like I haven't seen it myself, but at the same time, I've thought a lot about it. I've read a lot of accounts, and I've also talked to people who have some level of experience of this kind of thing, and it's interesting to think about. I think it's not so divorced from when we talk about mental illness. And mental illness is itself can be a kind of hell realm, but also in some extreme cases, it almost seems as though the person their mind is somewhat in that experience, that they're having that kind of experience within a human body. And so within the Buddhist understanding, it has to do with the karma, that the person has a very strong karma, even though they have a human body, which usually would shield them from that kind of experience, that it's just sort of poking through the boundary. So whatever the case may be, whatever might literally be actually happening, it's certainly that kind of experience is real. And thereby wanting to avoid that, wanting to live our lives in a way that we can create better experiences for ourselves in the future, and not just thinking that our actions now are inconsequential and there'll be no repercussions in the future. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so now we have the more positive aspect of it. If you remember at the beginning, there was thinking about how this life will not last, and that what potential consequences there will be in the future. And now we think about, well, what do we do to avoid that, to avert that? What is the positive way to live our life? And that starts with taking refuge. Now, the word refuge in Tibetan, refuge is a good translation in general. We think about what refuge means in English. Like if you take shelter under a tree, that's actually part of the word cap in Tibetan can mean that. It's like an overhanging rock or something that shields you from the elements. The point is that we recognize there is a potential for suffering. There are many sufferings that could befall us, and something that will protect us from that. Now we see here this boy standing under the statue of the Buddha. I mean, it's a metaphorical way of understanding it, that we actually do an act with our body because it helps us to cultivate that mental state. But it's not literally that we just go under the Buddha's hand and he protects us. As I sometimes point out to people when they talk about, because I know even people who have practiced Buddhism for many years, they will say if somebody sincerely practices and for all this time, why is it that they suddenly got cancer? And I'll say, well, the Buddha didn't say that if you practice my teachings, you won't experience birth, old age, sickness, and death, the main sufferings of life. That the point is that you won't be perturbed by them in the same way. Your mind will not, even if your body falls into that kind of harm, your mind will not be as disturbed by it as if you don't have any kind of mental refuge. We don't expect that some kind of magical thing to happen if we practice. But at the same time, we recognize that if our mind is strong, if we have a very strong sense of something better that we're cultivating, then it won't bother us in the same way as if we don't have anything to turn to. That's often, we use that expression in the world. Right? Where do I turn now? Medicine has not been effective, and nobody can save me from this suffering. So here we turn to an inner refuge. Right? Ultimately, refuge here is not about something external to us. That's an important point that sometimes gets overlooked. We talk about taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Those are the main refuges. But you said the ultimate meaning of that, the most advanced way of understanding that is in terms of the resultant Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the one that we will become. I take refuge in the future Buddha that I will become, and I take that as the direction where I'm going with my life. And so whatever happens, I see that as an obstacle on the way, or even in some sense part of the process, and I can view it in a very different way. And in the Dharma, meaning the realization that I will experience in my own mind, that I take refuge in this freedom from suffering that I can cultivate within myself, rather than expecting something externally to save me. So again, with this taking refuge, we have these five subjects here. So we go through them one at a time. We think about causes for taking refuge, which are mainly understood as fear is the first one, is the word that's used in the text, but really just, we could say, a accurate assessment of the way things are, a recognition that there is a possibility, or a very strong possibility, of experiencing things that are unwanted. And then faith, which means a sense that this refuge, if cultivated properly, has the power to shield me from that. And then we think about the objects of refuge, which means the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. What are they? And then the qualities of them. And then developing the mind of refuge, which is a sense of entrustment, a sense that I'm softening myself, I'm letting myself open to this possibility, and a sense of conviction, which it's often described also in the text. This has to come from our own ascertainment. It's not very stable if it just comes from somebody else telling us and believing their words. It has to come from our own examination and our own understanding of the qualities of this, and our own sense that this really is something worth cultivating. And then reflecting on the advice and commitments of refuge, which is important to do again and again, as long as we practice. If once we've taken refuge as Buddhists, then there are various advice and commitments, things that we try to follow. So, for example, making prostrations every morning, and when we see statues of the Buddha or of enlightened beings, that we behave to them as if it was the real person. Because if we do that, it will become that way for us, just as I talked about with Guru devotion before. If we treat the statue as something precious, then it will appear that way to our minds, and we'll gain something from having it. And likewise, we relate to Dharma text in a particular way. We don't put Dharma text on the floor, because the more we do that, the more that our mind will be open to the possibility of gaining something from it. And then also respect for senior practitioners. That's when we talk about the Sangha, the advices in terms of how to relate to people who have been practicing this path, and are having respect for each other. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so here we have developing faith in cause and effect. Just talking about karmic cause and effect. We're thinking about the way that actions accumulate and that we experience the results of those in the future. This is, I would say, one of the main topics that we discuss in our debates in the monastery for 20 years. Because this is not an easy thing to develop faith in. It's so contrary to what we see. And it's often an argument that's used against religion. Is that I think actually Nietzsche, the German philosopher, that explicitly said that. Many people probably said this as well, but that he said the belief that people who practice virtue are the ones who have positive results, and then the ones who practice evil have negative results, which is a general teaching also in Christianity, which he was arguing against. He said it's so contrary to our obvious experience that only a fool would accept that. Right? Well, if we think about it, if we're trying to believe that in terms of what we just see, then yes, that's true. We have to accept that. It's so clear that people who practice virtue, they don't always have the best results. Now, one thing that is important to actually contemplate on, first of all, is that while it's certainly not the case that people who practice virtue do not get in car accidents. That's just not so, that we don't see any real correlation with that as far as I'm aware, except maybe the people who don't drink while they're driving, something like that. But there is perhaps a correlation, people who practice virtue and the degree of mental happiness they have. That's something Nietzsche actually also rejected, but I sometimes feel, it's, if you want to see it that way, that'll appear to you that way, but maybe it's good we also, nowadays, we wouldn't, we base it on more robust evidence. People can actually do trials and look at this, rather than Nietzsche was often, I think, quite based on his own anecdotal experience. Whatever the case may be, though, within this lifetime, people have results, but we're thinking here also about future lifetimes. So that requires a lot of thought over a long time to really gain conviction in this. So as I said before, reading about accounts of reincarnation and the possibilities of it and thinking about the nature of mind. What is mind? And then even if there is such a thing as reincarnation, it does not necessarily imply that there is this karmic cause and effect. So there's a lot of talk, and this is what we debate about how is that carried? How does it make any sense? This is often an argument against reincarnation. What is reincarnating? What is, if an action is done, where is it carried and how is it manifest in the world? How does our way of thinking, our actions have any bearing on what happens externally? So this is not something that the philosophers in Buddhism took on faith. This is something that became the heart of all of the Indian philosophies. So that's a separate, I mean, it is part of this meditation, absolutely. You can meditate on that. You can come up with doubts and questions, but it's also something important to do when you're not just meditating, that you have time to study and reflect on these points and talk about them with people. That really is an important part of the practice. It's not just when we're sitting and sitting quietly and meditating. But in any case, here within the Lamrim, there's these reflections on the four general qualities of karma, which is talking about how karma is definite, how karma increases, that in a small action can have a large result, thinking that we will not meet with a karma that we did not create, result of a karma we did not create, and also that what we do create will not just disappear. And then we have the 10 non-virtues and their results, and the 10 virtuous actions. So this is thinking about the particularly heavy actions and wanting to avoid them. So the 10 non-virtues are going to be 3 of body, so that's killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, and then the 3 of speech, which is lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle speech, which really just means wasteful speech, not speaking in a way that is useful. And then 3 of mind, so then covetousness, harmful intent, and wrong views, tenaciously holding to rigid viewpoints. This blocks us from making any spiritual progress if we believe something quite contrary to that. And then the 10 virtues, the opposite of that. And then it says you can also use various forms of reflection to consider whether karma is a real thing and how. So that's sort of what I talked about to begin with. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide here. Okay, so now we have the sufferings of cyclic existence. So this is now moving on to the medium scope. Right? Before we were talking about the smaller scope. Now we're thinking more broadly. It's not about the wishing to achieve a better lifetime, but thinking about everything is bound to have this kind of this kind of dissatisfactoriness in the end. So we have different ways of contemplating on that. It's again a bit heavy perhaps, but this is how the teachings generally are. The 6 sufferings. So we think about the faults of uncertainty, the faults of dissatisfaction. I can describe these in detail. We don't have a lot of time, but I think also just from hearing them, it makes sense. It can resonate with a lot of us. And then in terms of reincarnation, it's talking about the fault of having to die again and again. That if we believed in reincarnation, but then we believe it would be nice just to have a nice life next time, we think, well, do we want to do that again and again and again and again? Go through the whole process and then be born again and again. And then having to go through all the sufferings of growing up again and again. Fault of constantly going from high to low. That's just the way things are. We never stay stable in our experience. And then fault of not having a companion. No matter what happens, we don't go from life to life with people. We go alone. We might meet the same people again. It's talked about in the teachings, but even then, it's not going to be forever. We have to experience this. It's our own impetus. So this medium scope is very much about our own sort of practicing with a sense of autonomy, that you gain the sense that I have to take responsibility for this. I can't expect somebody else to free me from this. Then we have the 3 sufferings, the 8 sufferings, and the 4 noble truths. I don't have time to go through all of those, or I'm already a little bit running behind, but you'll see this. It's just different ways of contemplating on suffering from different angles within the Lamrim. Okay, so we can go to the next slide here. So now the 12 links. So this is even more complicated. So as I said in the introduction, this is a very detailed explanation of how our own minds create this cycle. So we see here the picture of the wheel of life and the cycle of existence. We saw here before the lower part of it, but it's just an understanding that we cycle through this again and again. The 12 links can be a very powerful meditation, but it requires some degree of really study and thought before we can really understand what it's talking about. Now, I don't have time to go through it all today. This is just a brief overview. I did write an article about this some years ago that I don't know if any of you may have already seen, or if not, you can access this on the FPMT website. So it's, I think it's called Personalizing the 12 Links of Dependent Origination. You can easily find that. And I believe Venerable Rabina, some of you, I'm sure many of you know, wrote to me a couple of years ago. I was quite happy to hear that some people had been finding this helpful. So she was using it in their teaching in prison. And she actually had kind of taken that article I wrote and put it into kind of outline steps so that it was more broken up into a little pamphlet. So maybe that's available now. Unfortunately, I should have asked her to give me a copy when she finished. I don't think I did, but if you're able to obtain that, it might make it helpful. But the main point is that in the article, I go through all of this. So since I don't have time to explain it all one point at a time, if somebody is interested, you can access that. So we'll go on to the next slide now. Okay, so now we have the benefits of bodhicitta. So now we're moving on to the great scope, right? So now it's presented in much more positive language here than the middle scope. But it's important to understand that it has to be based in realistic thinking. And that's why the middle scope is essential to begin with. We don't just have a fantastical idea of I'm going to be this great enlightened being and everything's going to be okay. But within the understanding of the nature of suffering within life and the way that we are trapped in this cycle, then we start thinking, I want to really take responsibility in a big way. That I want to make this my life meaningful, not just for myself, but for as many beings as possible. So this is wishing to achieve full enlightenment. If it's really done this way, it's an extraordinary mind. It's something that makes the person, as it talks about in the benefits of it. So an ordinary person can become something extraordinary. It doesn't matter who you are. It's often said, of course, in ancient India, they talked about different castes and so forth, but however we talk about it, whatever your situation in life, whether you're successful or unsuccessful, if you have this mind, you immediately become an extraordinary person. It's something that's accessible to all of us. So we start with this benefits of bodhicitta, just reflecting on what are the benefits of, why do we want to cultivate this mental state? So there's many ways to think about the benefits, but rather than giving the outlines as before, I thought it's just nice to reflect on a couple of verses from Shantideva, whose text I'm sure many of you know, Engaging in the Bodhisattva Deeds, or sometimes translated as a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. Just puts this in poetry, in an inspiring way. So we start with, just like a salve that turns all things to gold, it takes this impure body and it makes a victor's holy form, a priceless gem. Hold fast to bodhicitta stalwartly. So we think that, of course, the ancient legend of alchemists, that there is a salve or some kind of potion that you put iron in it and turns it to gold. Well, here's the real thing like that. If somebody has this mind, then it transforms them into something precious. So hold fast to this mind. So steadfastly cultivate this mental state, and then and thereby mounting bodhicitta's steed that banishes all sorrow and fatigue, proceeding from delight to more delight, what knowing person would procrastinate. So we think that we have such an extraordinary opportunity. His Holiness the Dalai Lama quotes this verse quite frequently, the one I just read. This is the strongest mind we can have when somebody has such a positive outlook, such a strong sense of conviction in achieving this state. Then there's no room for becoming depressed and for feeling weary. We can see that with some people in life, that if their mind is so strong that there's no time for rest, there's no time to feel bad about things, like people that are just in ordinary conventional ways we see as extraordinary in the world. So like to give an example, in the last century, Mother Teresa, I read her biography. It's quite extraordinary to see how she lived her life, that she rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. Even though people often said to her, you need to sleep more, you're going to have health problems if you do this. But when somebody's mind is that strong, it just sustains them. That there's no room for wanting to be tired and wanting to feel bad about myself, because you're so concerned about others. Your mind is just so strongly concerned about being a benefit to other people. So that's something that it's not something that it just was given to her. That's something that she had that great opportunity, that great capability, and we don't. It's just a matter of cultivating it. So if we make effort, we can achieve that ourselves. It's not easy, but we think about the benefits at first, about why do I want to make such kind of effort. So we can go on to the next slide here. So then we go to developing equanimity. So thinking about there's no difference between myself and others, and between beings, rather than seeing as there's me and there's my friends and there's the people I support, we stop looking at the world in this divided way. So again, I've just given some verses rather than going through the outline. So again, from Shantideva, when both myself and others are alike and wishing only for our happiness, there's no distinction in myself and them. Why do I strive for my delight alone? When both myself and others are alike in wishing not the slightest suffering, there's no distinction in myself and them. Why not protect another, only me? So it's just thinking, he's asking why. What is the reason behind it? If might be her habitual way of relating to things, but we think about, is there any logical reason why this makes sense? So there's, of course, many ways to meditate on this. We might come up with the reasons that make sense. Well, one of the most obvious ones might be, well, if I work for my own happiness, I'll be happy. Others' happiness does not affect me. But then we think, is that true? Is that borne out in experience? So we have to use many kinds of ways of meditating or of contemplating to gradually shift our perspective here. So we can go on to the next slide again. Okay, so now sevenfold cause and effect. So this is the first of two main ways that we talk about cultivating bodhicitta. This way is generally understood as more of an emotional appeal, whereas the next one we'll see is more about using reasoning. So this is about trying to transform our usual way of relating to the world in terms of the people that we are close to, and expanding that. There's a term that's used nowadays in psychology, widening the circle of empathy. It's quite similar to what they're talking about here, that we generally have a sense of closeness with certain people in the world, and we relate to them in a particular way, but outside of that, it's just somebody who's a stranger, or even worse, somebody who we see as an enemy, or somebody that we want to eliminate. So the process here is to start with people that we're close to and try to expand that. So it talks about recognizing one's mothers. Usually it talks about in terms of people having had a connection with them in previous lifetimes. But however we do that, it's recognizing that every person is precious in their own right. There's different ways to contemplate on that. And what actually personally I find more effective is just thinking that everyone has that same network that we do. So just as I am precious to certain people, that everyone else is similarly relation to people in their life, to their family members, is precious. And why is it so much more important that my particular people that I'm close to, just because I happen to be close to them? So we start thinking about the kindness of other beings, and then recalling the kindness. We think about how kind people have been to us. We reflect in terms of traditionally, again, it's focused on one's mother, but it can be anybody that you find who has been very kind to you, and thinking about how much kindness others have shown to us, that anything we have achieved in this life is so much dependent upon the support of others, and the wishing to repay that, thinking about that if we were given so much within this lifetime, or even in other lifetimes, that we want to be able to do something that will benefit not just ourselves. We want to be able to expand that to as many beings as possible. Now, affectionate love, you see, is the fourth one. This is a particular kind of love. In Buddhism, we talk about many different kinds of love. Affectionate love is talking about a sense of closeness with others, a sense that when we see others, they appear to us as something pleasant and attractive, not in a romantic sense, but the sense that rather than we see certain people and they just seem ugly to us, or just not something that we're interested in. So we think about members of our family again, the way this works, right? A mother and her son, she doesn't see her son as precious because of his physical attractiveness. But at the same time, the son is seen as something that she wants to be close to. She's happy to be physically close to the son in a way that would feel uncomfortable with other people, because we feel that they're not my family in the way that this being close to them, it's almost repulsive to us. We're trying to overcome that so that we have the same sense of closeness with all beings. On that basis, then we develop compassion, which is the sense of wishing others to be free of suffering. And then on that basis, we have altruistic intention, which is an enhancement of that. It's thinking not only do I want others to be free of suffering, I want to take responsibility for that. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama often calls that universal responsibility. It's a sense that I'm responsible for all beings, that the problems in the world are not external to me, that I can take responsibility for it. It's not unrealistic, and we don't just think that everything that happens is my fault. That's not the point. But we think that I have an opportunity with this life that I have to make a contribution. And actually I can make a much bigger contribution than I might realize if I think about how I can cultivate my mind. So we see that this leads to bodhicitta. It's of course, if somebody takes the altruistic intention and decides that they want to do something like be a doctor or be a great donor in charity, that's perfectly fine. That's actually a great thing to do. But the goal here is that to think even more so, I want to be an enlightened being. That is the best contribution I can make. And so using this contemplation to lead to that final step of bodhicitta. So we can go on to the next slide. So we have exchanging self for others. So I mentioned before, this is the more logical, reasoning way of thinking about this. So it begins with equanimity. So we talked about that, but then rather than thinking about in an emotional way, we think about our parents and our family and trying to widen that feeling of closeness. We just think about the disadvantages. We think logically. People who are very selfish, people who spend their lives working just for their own happiness, what is the result of that? We can use that. There are many examples that are given in the text. We can go through them. We can also just use examples in our life or even historically. It's in some sense, it's very helpful sometimes to be aware, be quite educated and know many different examples of people in history or in current events who act in selfish ways. And what is the result that they get? Are they mentally happy as a result of that? Do people like them? As Shantideva talks about in his text, that somebody might be a great donor and care for many people, but if they're angry, nobody wants to be around them, and they actually destroy that relationship. So whereas somebody who acts in a selfless way, who's always kind to others, will just naturally have many friends, regardless of whether they give them money or they have something to offer them physically. That attitude will bring us happiness. And then they're considering the advantages of cherishing others, to go on the other way, that what happens when people are selfless. So I used the example before of Mother Teresa or other people we can think about who really just seem to think their whole life about benefiting others. What was the result for them? Not to mention what was the result for other people. They had a strong sense of personal determination, that they had this not falling into depression and all kinds of other mental problems, that their mind is very strong. And then equalizing itself and other is the fourth step. So thereby it's just thinking about that. So it's talked about that it doesn't mean that you think I am others and others are me. It's a misconception. It's not that it's like kind of a mystical thing. It's just thinking about equalizing in the sense of importance. That rather than thinking that I'm the most important and my own happiness is the most important thing, it's thinking that actually the purpose of my life is to work for everyone, and thinking about the best solution for all beings that accounts for as many people and also sentient beings, so animals as well, as possible. And then finally, taking and giving. Some of you might know this meditation Tonglen, where you imagine this. You imagine taking on the suffering of others and giving happiness, which is the opposite of how we usually relate to the world. We often just try to block the things that are uncomfortable and try to invite in the things that are pleasant for us. We try to cultivate the opposite attitude here. Okay, so now we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so we're running out of time a bit here, but I'll just go through these a bit briefly. Maybe we'll see next week also if we have time. So we have the first 4 perfections. These are the practices of the Bodhisattva: generosity, ethical discipline, patience, and joyous effort. Yeah, I think what might make more sense, rather than trying to rush through this, because it is useful to talk about these. Why don't I talk about it next week? There's just 3 more slides, I believe. So we can stop for the time being. Why don't, before we take off the slides, actually, though, please go to the last slide, because that has the discussion questions for the week. So, okay, so discussion topics: meditation and suggested reading. So we have, what is the advantage of considering the path in a graded manner? We can think about it for ourselves. There's no right or wrong answer to this. And then what might be the potential pitfalls of doing so? Is there reasons that it might be problematic if we adhere too strongly to this? And then why the later stage is not possible without a foundation in the earlier one? So again, I alluded to that a bit. We can think about each stage individually and why might the early ones might be important as a foundation for that. So then what can we meditate on this week? Well, we talked last week about how to do analytical meditation on the basis of the preparatory practices we talked about before. Now we have some subjects to meditate on. So you could choose one subject and use that every day, or you could alternate subjects day to day, but choose any of them and try to go through them using this basis of this foundation of the meditations we did. And then some suggested readings if you're interested. I think I mentioned some of these before. The Illuminating the Path to Enlightenment I mentioned earlier in the talk. I think you can get that for free online, and it's always been offered for free, and I think nowadays you can download it. And then Geshe Zopa's book I mentioned last week, the 5 volumes of the steps on the path. So if you want a much more extensive way of going through this, but I think in English, at least my experience, that I like that one the most. I really liked Geshe Zopa personally. And I think that his way of explaining it, because he was teaching himself in English, right? A lot of the times it's a translation of somebody's Tibetan teaching, but Geshe-la, having lived in Wisconsin for 50 years, was quite fluent in English and understood the mindset of people in the modern world and in our culture. And then this extended Lamrim outlines is just put out by Kopan. I think it's the FPMT website, you can get that. So that just gives you a lot of these topics I gave just with the outlines themselves. So then when you're actually meditating, you might read the context of it in a much more in-depth book, but you actually just have them one at a time, clearly laid out for you. So that can be helpful. Okay, so why don't we have a couple questions and answers now? Let's see if anybody has. Ooh. Yes, so there's a question there. I'm trouble getting this on the full screen for myself. Yeah, so Neem and Fisha.
Yeah, Venerable. Is it possible to practice Tantra without understanding Guru devotion?
Not really, no. I think in Tantra, that's even more important. It's talked about that. It really is the essence of Tantra, is trying to cultivate the perception of one's teacher as enlightened. And the pure perception is talked about in Tantra. that is the foundation of it. That is the practice itself, is trying to cultivate. To give a very brief outline of it, it said that so it said that the sutra, which is the non-tantric teachings, it's called the causal vehicle, which said it's presented from the perspective of creating causes now to be enlightened in the future. So we talked about all these contemplations today, and that's the kind of the underlying assumption, is that right now I'm not an enlightened being, and how can I contemplate in a way that will bring me to enlightenment? Whereas in Tantra, it's called the resultant vehicle, that we imaginatively create this sense that I am enlightened now. It's not wishful thinking. It's not that we deceive ourselves. It's a way of, it's, as I said, using imagination as a way of, within our path, using the human capacity for imagination in a skillful way toward the spiritual path. And within that, we view the teacher as an enlightened being. So again, as I said before, we have to choose somebody that we really can do that with. We don't want it. It's very dangerous if we end up choosing the wrong person, and then we get into this cycle of just whatever they say is right, even if it doesn't make any sense. That's very dangerous. So we have to choose the right teacher, but within that, start to cultivate that mindset. There are many other practices within Tantra. Mainly, there's visualization. There's visualization of a mandala. There are working with the energy channels of the body, which is the completion stage. I'll mention that a bit also next week. But all of it is based on the foundation of this relationship with the teacher. Otherwise, it really can be dangerous. Trying to do these kinds of meditations of the energies of the body without proper guidance, without proper foundation and preparation, it can be a lot more dangerous than in a way that the other meditations are not going to be, because you're opening yourself to something. It's a bit like if people take drugs, right? People take certain drugs that can give them great experience sometimes, but oftentimes it can also have the opposite effect, that it really disturbs their mind. So if we're going to work with energies in our body, which is a similar idea, then there's a lot of capacity to go astray. We need proper guidance in that. And we need that grounding of the teacher to be able to know when we're ready, and to be able to just focus on that as an anchor for our mind, that we don't just kind of go off into a dissociated state, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes. You have another question, or is that
Yeah,
the
I
same
do
one?
right now.
Yeah,
Different.
okay.
But
Okay,
maybe
yeah, please go ahead.
I'm assuming we'll probably get into it next week, so you can answer this next week. I was trying to figure out if there's any way for you to recognize when you've perfected a perfection.
Oh, a way to recognize, absolutely. Yeah. Is talk about that in the teachings, about the stages of realization. And I will try to talk about that a bit next week, but this is briefly. I mean, the perfections are quite advanced practices, right? So, like, for example, in terms of the perfection of generosity, it said that the measure of having perfected that is that you can give anything without any sense of attachment. When somebody needs something, you immediately are able to give, even to the point of giving your body. So, I mean, people give organs and so forth these days. That there's something to be said for that. I think that's quite an admirable practice if it can be done wisely. We don't want to damage our body, but at the same time, to a certain extent, if it's a matter of how much damage to how much benefit to somebody else, if we're really able to do that without any sense of regret, that is a very good sign. There's different levels of it, of the cultivation of it. So it also has to be done with wisdom. So it's not just that we do this without sort of recklessly, but if somebody in a measured way it has really no attachment to that, and not just attachment to physical things, but also to their own viewpoints, right? Somebody does not get a sense of sort of miserliness about this is my idea and I don't like your idea. These are all signs if somebody is really able to hear out other people. These are very positive signs on these stages. In terms of perfection of the other perfections, well, I guess, yeah, I don't want to have to go into all of it now, but you can see in the Lamrim at the end of every section, at least in the great stages of the path, Tsongkhapa will talk about, here are the signs that you can look for, that you've achieved, that you're making progress in the right way. And so whether or not we've actually achieved it, it's perfected. I mean, really perfected it would mean to be a Buddha. To be having achieved the perfection would be somebody is completely enlightened. But in terms of at least having some kind of realization of it, signs then that we want to look for, then those are available there. So, and I will try to mention that as one of the topics next week.
Right. I wanted to clarify because I've learned you need to perfect one before you can perfect the other. And so, but you're practicing all of them consecutively. Well, not consecutively, you're practicing all of them at once. So it's like, do I look for signs that I've perfected this one before I go to the other one and then look for signs for perfection? Or is it that you just practice all of them and the signs?
Yeah, it's okay.
The signs
are it's certainly not that you want to just, okay, I'll practice generosity. Once that's perfect, then I'll practice ethical discipline, right? That we have to go through them. We practice them in, what's the word? In an interdependent way, that they have to enhance each other. And so, as I said, there's never, unless we're really enlightened, there's always more there's always farther we can go. So really there's signs of making progress rather than we might say signs of complete perfection of it. And it's also that we talked about just now, one of the discussion questions is what are the potential pitfalls? This could be one of them, is if somebody thinks within the graded path that I have to be absolutely perfect at this earlier stage before I'm able to do anything about the later stage. Really, we can practice all of them at any time. So it's said here that we really have to understand about the suffering of samsara before we can generate true compassion. Well, in a strict sense, yes, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be compassionate before that. It's going to take a long time. But to really understand about it'll get deeper and deeper as it's enhanced, as it's supported by the earlier stages. But there's no, this is a general framework, and all of it has to be accessible within our lives. So it's not, life is not nearly so linear as it's presented in the text. There's always going to, we just happen to have the situation today where we are forced to practice compassion. We're forced to work on our generosity, work on our patience. So we always have to be aware of that and applying them. But it's just presented in this framework as a way that we can keep it in order in our minds. We think about how do the practices relate to one another. But it's not going to be so strict. That is perhaps the answer, or one of the answers to that question about the potential pitfalls.
Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah. Venerable, on the same subject then.
Okay.
When you're perfecting the six perfections, are you heading towards realizing emptiness on the way to becoming a Buddha?
Yes, absolutely. It said that if you can practice them within an understanding of emptiness, then that is going to enhance them as well. So emptiness, I mean, really, it's presented as the final stage here. It's interesting because it said, at least in our philosophical text, that to really generate bodhicitta in a profound way, and an understanding of emptiness is necessary, because we have to have some sense of enlightenment as a real thing. That has to come from a sense that it's possible to rid ourselves of delusion. And that has to come from an understanding of emptiness, an understanding of the antidote to delusion. So as with everything here, we can always go more deeply into it. And so when we do have some understanding of emptiness, that's not just intellectual understanding, although that is the beginning stage, something that actually informs the way we live our lives, then we can bring that in, and it will enhance the way that we're able to do these practices. But again, it's not linear. We'll have opportunities at different times, right? So we might find that there's some teaching being given on emptiness. We don't have to think, well, I'm not there yet, I won't go. I mean, if it's really too advanced, then maybe not. But at the same time, if we have the opportunity to receive that teaching now, we can do that. And we know that it might take a while before I'm able to understand this in a deeper way, but we can kind of touch all our bases and gradually bring it all together into a practice. It's not always going to go in that order.
Okay,
Awesome.
thank you.
Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah.
Venerable, we have
Okay.
one last question
Okay, yeah,
in
please.
chat.
Okay.
Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I'm having a little difficulty with the protocol here because it's not the computer. So please read it for me. Yeah.
If I find myself in some disassociated state, how can I bring myself back?
Okay, that's a good question. There's of course many methods that are given in modern psychology as well, but Buddhism does have some things to offer for that. And there are different ways. I mean, one of the most important things is just to keep physically healthy. That are it's talking about the energy channels of our body, and that has an effect on the way that our mind functions. So if we find that we've become very dissociated, meditation, if we do it properly, it could help with that, but it could also, if we don't do it properly, it could make it worse. So it can be good just to do some kind of physical practice to ground ourselves. And nowadays, physical yoga has become very popular, and I actually think that's a good thing. If we don't have to, if we don't go too far to the thinking that people who are yoga champions are enlightened, that's not quite the case. But nevertheless, it's a really good practice for grounding our mind, as well as enhancing our physical body. So that would be something I would suggest. Also, just day to day, that we, rather than thinking too much, just do some kind of physical activity to ground yourself. Also, just following a schedule day to day is really helpful. So like with meditation, it's good to have a particular schedule each day that we follow, and we don't have to be entirely strict about it, but in terms of the way we structure it within our life, within our career or whatever that might be, these things are not separate from each other. And so if we're unemployed and we're in a down and out situation in our life, it's going to carry over into our meditation, and that could also lead to kind of getting more dissociated. So we have to try to build a basis such that our life can support our meditation. There are many other modalities that are available, and we have to see what's available to us. Nowadays, things like massage and acupuncture also could be helpful for somebody if they're really experiencing this in a strong way. And of course, Western medicine has its own its own modalities. There is medicine that is psychotropic medicine, which I'm actually, honestly, I have to say, and I'm not an expert on it, but I'm a little bit skeptical from what I've read about it, that I think it in certain cases it might really be helpful. And don't quote me on it, because again, I'm always open to hearing from people who are more expertise than I do. But I think it's different than the way that it's understood in Buddhist philosophy about the way that the mind functions. And so I think learning to integrate our body and our health in a more holistic way, generally speaking, is, I think, could be more helpful. But at the same time, if it's very extreme, and we have a doctor who we trust who can help us with that, we have to also take that into consideration. And working with a therapist or somebody who is able to help us, people who are really trained in this modality and qualified in that. It's certainly not antithetical to following a spiritual path. That we have to be practical about where we are. So that's a very long answer to your question, but again, that's a very broad subject, and it's a very important point, because we see that we're working with our mind, and that's a delicate thing. We talk about these advanced kinds of practices. We have to be very practical about where we are and our capacity, and if it's having these kind of effects on us, we have to find skillful ways to deal with that. And not sometimes people who become spiritual, they follow spiritual paths, and they kind of get into a bit of denial about that. They think, well, everything that happens is part of my spiritual path, and thereby not actually deal with the psychological effects of that. So there are methods that are offered today. We can take advantage of those if we have access to them. But we also have to, within the spiritual practice, temper it and not just rush into advanced practices that really can be. If we talked about the tantric meditations, and people had questions about that. For most people, probably it's not going to have that much effect, because their mind is not that open to it. So it's not going to have much positive or negative effect. But for some people, it might really, who have some kind of spiritual inclination, something might happen in their mind, and that if it's done properly, then the proper grounding can bring that in the right direction. But if not so, then unfortunately, it can have really devastating consequences. We have to take that seriously, and be careful what kind of practices we engage in. Okay, so I've gone over time already. I apologize. That seems to happen. So we didn't have much time to do a group meditation today, but let's just sit quietly for 1 minute or so, and then we can say goodbye, and we'll have the final session again next week. Okay, thank you all. So I hope to see you again next week for the final session.
Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah.